August 6, 1943. The waters of Vella Gulf were silent. Too silent. Thick jungle shadows from Vella and Kolombangara framed a narrow stretch of black ocean, where 6 American destroyers crept along at minimum wake. Deep inside the USS Dunlap, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger watched the pulse of his SG radar, waiting for the moment he had trained months to meet. When 4 distant contacts appeared, he knew this night could finally break a year of humiliating defeats. Within minutes, dozens of American torpedoes would slice through the dark, and Japanese dominance in night fighting would begin to crumble. Before we begin, subscribe for more untold turning points of World War II. When Japan seized footholds across the Solomons, it inherited a logistics nightmare. Garrisons clung to jungle islands under the shadow of American air power. Slow freighters could not survive daylight. A single scouting patrol from Henderson Field could summon dive bombers that turned cargo decks into funeral pyres. Out of that pressure came a dangerous workaround the sailors nicknamed the Tokyo Express. Frontline destroyers, built to hunt and screen, repurposed as nocturnal freighters. They ran blacked out at 30 knots, hugging reefs and rain squalls, decks stacked with fuel, rice, and ammunition lashed in steel drums. Near the beaches they dared not linger. Crews simply kicked the drums overboard and prayed currents and shore parties would find them before the sea did. On a good night, only a fraction reached hungry troops. The rest sank, burst, or drifted into darkness. Every run kept men alive and bled the fleet. Each destroyer burned on supply duty was one less blade in Japan's scabbard. Shipyards could not replace losses. Fuel was tight. Veteran crews were irreplaceable. Yet without the Express, outposts on Kolombangara and Vella would starve and die. So the runs continued, again and again, along the same black corridors of water through Vella Gulf. American eyes were watching. Coast watchers on jungle ridges counted wakes. Radio intercepts sketched schedules. PT boats tried first and failed. Their torpedoes broke faith, fizzling, diving deep, or erupting early. Japanese confidence grew with every escape. By August 1943, the pattern was fatal for them. The United States had learned the lanes, trained for the night, and crucially, fixed its torpedoes. 6 destroyers under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger slid into Vella Gulf not to chase, but to hunt. The Express would run on time, the ambush would be waiting. The era of Japanese certainty after dark was about to end. What followed was not a duel of bravado, but a cold test of tools and timing. Night in the Solomons was not just dark, it was absolute. Moonlight smothered by cloud, islands hulking like black walls, waves whispering against hull plating. Into this void crept Task Group 31.2, 6 American destroyers moving at barely a murmur. This was no wandering patrol. Every helm order, every engine adjustment, every plotted bearing was choreographed hours earlier aboard USS Dunlap, where Commander Frederick Moosbrugger gathered his captains and drilled them like surgeons rehearsing an operation. He outlined not only the plan, but the why behind every turn. Communications could shatter in night combat, wires severed, radios jammed by gun blasts, confusion blooming faster than flame. Each captain had to fight as if cut off, yet remain part of a single deadly machine. It was a doctrine born from painful lessons. Salvos fired too late, columns too long, torpedoes wasted, cruisers gutted by Japanese long-lance attacks. That would not happen tonight. Radar was their lantern. The new SG surface search set painted contacts on phosphor screens long before human eyes could pierce the dark. Operators hunched over the displays, fingers tapping bearings, calling ranges in crisp, controlled murmurs. On Japanese ships, older sets blurred land and sea into meaningless haze. Their lookouts strained into blackness, unaware death was already triangulating. Moosebrugger divided his destroyers into two lethal fists. The first, Dunlap, Craven, and Maury, would unleash torpedoes and peel away, refusing the enemy any obvious target. Behind them angled the second trio, Lang, Sterrett, and Stack, their torpedo tubes partly replaced with heavy 40mm guns, ready to shred barges and survivors, and to finish whatever the torpedoes merely wounded. No chatter, no wasteful radio bursts, just the steady hum of turbines and the occasional clatter of binoculars as officers swept for silhouettes against faint starlight. Below decks, crews waited beside torpedo tubes, hands on greased levers, sweating in the heat, whispering a simple prayer. Please let them work this time. Because they knew the truth. For 20 brutal months, their torpedoes had betrayed them, running deep, misfiring, striking like fists made of chalk. Sailors had watched perfect shots fizzle as Japanese destroyers raced away untouched. Trust had died one dud at a time. But tonight was different. Contact exploders had been reforged, magnetic triggers disabled, depth settings corrected. For the first time, the Mark 15 torpedo was honest. And as the American line slid north along the invisible wall of Kolombangara's coastline, every bearing ticked closer to the inevitable. Japanese destroyers were inbound, engines pushing against a calendar of routine. They had run this path before, too many times. Tonight, familiarity would be fatal. In the dark, Moosebrugger allowed himself one thought. Finally, it's our turn to strike first. At 23:33 hours, a quiet voice in Dunlap's Combat Information Center sliced through the humid tension. Surface contacts, bearing 330, range 29,000 yards. 4 distinct pips, moving south, right on schedule. No need for speculation. The Tokyo Express had arrived. Moosebrugger didn't cheer. He simply nodded, and the bridge snapped into measured action. Orders whispered down voice tubes. Helmsmen eased the rudder. Engineers bled just enough steam to steady speed. The destroyers adjusted formation like wolves drifting through tall grass, silent, unseen, positioning for a throat bite. The Japanese column, oblivious, pressed south at 20 knots. Their attention fixated on the beaches near Vella, not on the quiet waters behind them. Their tired lookouts scanned the open western horizon, where faint cloud glow made silhouettes easy to catch. They did not search toward the looming dark lump of Kolombangara, where American hulls blended with jungle shadow. Radar gave the Americans a view beyond human sight, a window into movement, formation, even course changes. Operators traced arcs with grease pencils, calculating a firing bearing before any enemy eyeball could ever see. Aboard the Japanese destroyer Shigure, Captain Tomotsu Hara sensed nothing amiss. His torpedoes pointed portside toward Vella, the direction Japanese intelligence insisted was clean. His radar showed only islands, no blinking threats. Doctrine taught that the Americans stumbled at night. Tonight would be no different. Meanwhile, in Craven's torpedo room, sailors loaded the last Mark 15. The warhead's dull metal plating hid 663 pounds of Torpex, deadlier than TNT, engineered to buckle keels instead of just punching holes. Men checked safety wires 3 times, hands shaking not with fear, but with memory. They had seen too many duds. Not tonight. Division A2, swinging wide, maneuvered to cut across the Japanese column's path, like a blade awaiting the moment of impact. Their role was subtle, yet lethal. Punish any evasive turn, erase survivors, and protect Division A-1's retreat. Minutes crawled. Ranges dropped. 9,000 yards, 7,000, 6,000. Japanese officers still read empty horizons, lulled by routine and confidence built on 2 years of unchallenged night supremacy. Then, silence sharpened. Moosbrugger leaned over the radar plotter. Torpedo crews braced. Bearings steadied. Speeds aligned. Geometry locked into a perfect kill pattern. The destroyers held their breath. Because in night combat, the side that struck first often struck last. With the enemy silhouetted against faint western sky, unaware, unready, steaming straight into the jaws of a trap woven from mathematics and revenge, the moment for vengeance approached. One order, whispered into headsets and shouted through steel decks, would unleash the torpedoes that American sailors had waited 20 months to trust. Stand by to fire. When the order came at 23:41, it landed like a hammer blow. Division A-1's torpedo crews moved with mechanized calm, men who had rehearsed this moment in daylight and dread. Dunlap fired first. 8 dark cylinders slipped from their tubes and vanished into the black like falling stars. Craven and Maury followed in tight succession until 24 Mark 15 sliced the Gulf, each set to 6 feet and 46 knots. Silent, hot, and deadly. The boats executed a textbook 90-degree break, roaring away to starboard, increasing distance and denying the Japanese any easy reply. In under a minute, the assault had been launched. In 6 minutes, it would be decided. The geometry was brutal in its simplicity. The Americans had forced the Japanese into a position where broadside exposure met a converging torpedo spread. Torpedoes, once cursed by malfunction, now ran true. No premature magnetic blasts. No depth ghosts. The Mark 15 carried Torpex, an explosive designed to shatter hulls rather than merely punch holes. Where one struck, structure would crumble. Where 2 struck, a ship's spine could be broken in half. At 23:46, the night detonated. The first concussion came like a struck bell, a dark, rolling boom that tipped the sea into a moment of hellish illumination. Hajikaze erupted amidships, flames clawing skyward as fuel and stores ignited. Arashi took a catastrophic hit to her forward magazine. The explosion tore her into a blistering column of fire. Kawakaze shuddered, her plating buckling under a torpedo's hungry blast. In minutes, 3 destroyers that had steamed with arrogant routine were burning, breaking, going down. The American destroyers did not gloat. They crossed back to the scene with trained efficiency. Division A-2's guns opened once the muzzle flashes confirmed successful strikes, sweeping remaining targets with 5-inch shells that finished wrecks and quelled any resistance. The night became a tableau of flame, debris, and men thrown into the water. Life rafts and wreckage drifted under stars now sullied by oil fires. Rescue attempts were made, but Japanese sailors, shaped by Bushido and propaganda, often refused salvation, pushing away lines, swimming for islands, choosing death over capture. A handful were taken aboard, but most perished or vanished in the dark. The scene was grim proof that tactical victory often carried human tragedy. In 30 minutes, the battle was over. In 6 decisive minutes, the Tokyo Express had been shattered. The mathematics of the engagement, radar detection, corrected torpedoes, coordinated geometry, immediate maneuver, had converted American technological fixes into battlefield reality. For the destroyer crews who fired the torpedoes, it was proof that months of bureaucratic failure and deadly frustration had been overcome by engineering, by doctrine, and by sheer resolve. For the Japanese, it was a rupture in a myth. Night invincibility was no longer guaranteed. As the shattered remnants of the Japanese column burned, the dark waters of Vella Gulf turned into a floating pyre. Slicks of fuel ignited into orange ribbons that painted dancing reflections across the waves. Exploded ammunition cooked off in popping bursts, echoing like distant rifle fire. For the American destroyer crews, the smell of scorched oil, burned paint, and salted steam pressed against the senses like a physical weight. No cheers rose from the decks. Victories at sea rarely sounded like triumph. They sounded like fire and steel tearing apart. Debris drifted everywhere. Splintered wood, twisted metal, shoes, helmets, and personal effects from men who minutes before had been preparing to offload cargo. Hundreds of survivors thrashed in the black water. Their voices carried through the smoke, some calling for help, others shouting indistinct phrases as they battled exhaustion and burns. The Americans, trained to rescue whenever possible, maneuvered carefully toward scattered groups, throwing life rings and lines into the sea. But what came next stunned them. Many Japanese sailors refused to grab the ropes. Some pushed them away with trembling hands. Others, despite burns and shock, turned and swam desperately toward Vella, 4 miles away through current and darkness. A few survivors clung silently to debris, drifting out of reach rather than touch the hands of an enemy. American sailors watched in disbelief as drowning men chose the water over rescue. This was not defiance for show. It was carved into the psychological bone of the Imperial Navy. Japanese training manuals taught that capture equaled shame, abandonment of duty, family, and emperor. Propaganda whispered that prisoners would be tortured. Cultural doctrine insisted that death preserved honor. Survival through captivity destroyed it. Bushido, already mythologized, had been twisted into policy. Better the sea than humiliation. Only those too badly wounded to resist were taken aboard. Some collapsed on deck, whispering apologies in Japanese. Others stared angrily upward, wounded more by shame than shrapnel. American medics treated them anyway. Compassion for the U.S. Navy was not conditional. Meanwhile, the roaring flames illuminated a grim sight. Sailors slipping beneath the surface, exhausted, their shadows disappearing forever. The Americans recorded it in logbooks simply as refused assistance, a sterile phrase that concealed profound tragedy. As the destroyer crews navigated slowly among wreckage, they repeated the ritual. Call out, throw lines, urge contact. Again and again, hands batted the ropes away. It was a moment that revealed the vast gulf between two worlds. To the Americans, rescue was duty. To the Japanese, rescue was dishonor. By 0003 hours, the last of the burning hulls rolled and slipped beneath the waves, hissing as flame met sea. The battlefield fell eerily quiet. No victorious music swelled. No sailors danced. Men simply stood at rails, staring into fire-lit waters that still carried voices fading into silence. That night, the U.S. Navy learned something chilling. Defeating Japanese destroyers required striking not just steel, but a belief system that valued death over survival. And in the cold calculus of war, that meant future engagements would be more ruthless, more sudden, and less forgiving. The sea still burned. The psychological lessons burned brighter. Far to the north of the flaming chaos, one lone silhouette clawed its way through the darkness. The destroyer Shiger, her stern twisted, steering gear damaged by the single-dud American torpedo of the night. Captain Tamichi Hara fought the helm like a wounded animal. His ship zigzagged unpredictably, not out of clever tactic, but because the rudder no longer obeyed fully. Every turn risked spinning her into an illuminated kill zone. Every minute kept her within range of American radar. Inside Shigure's bridge, tension stretched tight as piano wire. Men whispered prayers, eyes fixed on the black horizon. Hara ordered his torpedo crews to launch a spread in desperation. 8 deadly Type 93 long lances tore into the night, their wakes invisible. But the shots were blind, fired at ghosts. Somewhere beyond the smoke, American destroyers maneuvered steadily, never presenting a silhouette. Each minute that passed without return, fire felt unreal, as if fate itself intervened. Hara didn't know it, but the Americans had no interest in pursuit. Their victory was already absolute, and chasing a damaged ship deeper into the archipelago risked aerial detection by dawn. Commander Mugger's orders were coldly rational. Secure the battlefield. Save who can be saved. Prepare for another wave. Hunting down a solitary cripple in pitch darkness offered no advantage. Still, Shigure's crew expected impact at any second. Men flinched at every shudder of the hull. Lookouts scanned feverishly, expecting searchlights to snap on and swallow them. And for the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese destroyer sailors felt hunted in the night. By 0040 hours, the Gulf behind her glowed faintly from dying fires. Bodies drifted like debris. Communications crackled with silence. 3 sister ships gone. Thousands of tons of steel and hundreds of lives erased in 6 minutes. Hara understood immediately. This defeat wasn't tactical. It was doctrinal. Japan's reputation as supreme masters of night combat had been earned in 1942 through shock, surprise, and their fearsome long-lance torpedoes. American radar had seemed clumsy, their torpedoes unreliable, their formations vulnerable. Victory at night had felt inevitable. Not anymore. As Shigure limped north, Hara mentally replayed the opening moments. There had been no warning. Radar had betrayed them. American torpedoes, those broken teeth, had struck flawlessly. Their formations, once tight with confidence, had become perfect targets. Somewhere in that smoky gulf, Japanese naval doctrine died quietly. Meanwhile, aboard Mugger's ships, the tone was eerily professional. Damage reports, 0. Casualties, 1 sailor injured by machinery, not enemy action. Log entries recorded clean torpedo spreads, confirmed detonations, avoided counterfire. It read like a training exercise. But sailors on deck felt the shift. They whispered among themselves that something fundamental had changed, that the Japanese were no longer the unstoppable phantoms of the slot. For the first time since the war began, American destroyer crews believed Shigure would become known as the luckiest destroyer in the Imperial Navy. Historians would note that she survived multiple actions that should have killed her, but in truth, she was merely the witness to a turning tide. Her escape did not preserve Japanese advantage. It carried home the seed of doubt. For the Imperial Navy, doubt was poison. Within weeks, officers debated the unthinkable. Were their night tactics obsolete? Did radar render human eyes worthless? Could doctrine forged in the pre-war years survive industrial adaptation? Japan's greatest fear was realized. Not that America would fight harder, but that America would learn. That night, as Shigure's silhouette vanished into the blackness, the Pacific quietly shifted balance. One ship lived. An entire strategy died. The Gulf slowly quieted, but the aftermath burned like a vision from some maritime underworld. Fuel oil fanned out across the black surface, igniting into ragged sheets of flame. They drifted in irregular, twisting shapes, fiery islands that hissed and crackled as ammunition continued to cook off aboard sinking hulls. Every explosion cast towering shadows of masts, smoke columns, and drifting wreckage that bobbed among drifting bodies. The night stank of diesel, burning paint, and cordite. American searchlights cut through the smoke, illuminating patches of devastation that looked almost unreal. Survivors floated among the glowing slicks, coughing, calling, sometimes screaming. Some clung to shattered planks, others kicked feebly for shore. When American destroyers cautiously approached, sailors tossed life rings and lowered nets. But almost universally, the Japanese shrank away, shaking their heads, refusing hands extended to them. Many swam back toward the burning oil rather than be lifted aboard. To surrender was dishonor. To be captured was to live in shame. American sailors stared in disbelief as one man released his grip on debris, whispered something into the dark, and simply slipped beneath the surface. Inside the American ships, no cheers erupted. The victory was too quick, too one-sided, too grim. Officers exchanged quiet nods, aware of what had been accomplished, and what it meant. Naval warfare had turned a corner. This was no longer the twilight duel of lookouts and instinct. It was combat defined by machinery, electronics, and reliability. On the chart tables in the combat information centers, radar tracks told stories more clearly than human eyes ever could. As the fires died and the splashes ceased, destroyer captains reviewed damage reports. All clear. Not a single enemy shell had struck. Crews checked torpedo rooms to find blanks in their racks, where moments earlier polished warheads had gleamed. The weapons had run straight, detonated cleanly, and shattered everything they hit. Months of frustration, torpedoes passing harmlessly beneath hulls, failing to explode, or detonating prematurely, were washed away with the flames. In Tokyo, days later, intelligence officers stared at casualty lists and after-action reports with quiet dread. The destroyers lost at Vella Gulf were not ordinary cargo hulls. They were elite ships, staffed by elite crews. Their loss tore chunks from Japan's already shrinking pool of trained sailors. Worse, the method of their destruction shattered confidence. Veteran captains whispered that radar had defeated eyesight, that doctrine built over decades had been eclipsed in seconds. The Tokyo Express, once Japan's lifeline to scattered island garrisons, entered decline. After Vella Gulf, the runs grew tentative. Cargoes shrank. Routes varied. Escorts multiplied. Efficiency collapsed. The desperate drum method of resupply delivered less and less. Hungry soldiers on jungle islands waited for drums that never washed ashore. Disease and starvation spread beneath the palms. The empire's edges began to rot. American commanders, reviewing signals, realized something profound. Technological problems they had battled internally, the institutional stubbornness, the broken torpedo exploders, the misused destroyers, were finally resolved. That meant their learning curve no longer curved. It climbed. Within months, the same doctrine that shattered 3 destroyers in 6 minutes reappeared at Cape St. George, at Empress Augusta Bay, at Surigao Strait. Radar-led torpedo ambushes became routine, not exceptional. Japan's destroyer force, designed for offense, was slowly bled to death performing logistics. Ironically, the more desperate their supply situation became, the more destroyers they risked, and the more they lost. The Tokyo Express faded into history, not with a dramatic final mission, but with a slow dwindling of courage, materiel, and lives. When historians later traced its demise, they pointed not to its last run, but to that single blazing hour in Vella Gulf. The moment when surprise no longer belonged to Japan. The moment when American torpedoes detonated on command. The moment when radar turned darkness into advantage. The waters that night reflected burning ships and sinking doctrine, and beneath those flames, the Pacific pivoted. When dawn crept over Vella Gulf, the flames had faded, leaving only drifting smoke and scattered wreckage. Musger's destroyers returned to base untouched, their crews exhausted but silent, knowing they had crossed an invisible threshold. In just 6 minutes, American radar, corrected torpedoes, and new doctrine shattered a reputation the Imperial Navy had carried since the war's beginning. From that night forward, Japanese destroyer captains no longer sailed with absolute confidence, and American crews no longer feared night engagements. The Tokyo Express withered, island garrisons starved, and momentum shifted permanently. Historians would later point to this quiet, brutal victory, not for its scale, but its proof. Machines worked. Tactics evolved. Fear reversed direction. In those 6 minutes of fire and oil-soaked water, the Pacific War bent toward its inevitable end.